She had promised herself she would not cry. Not for them, not ever again. But when she found the room, when her fingers trailed along the shelves and she felt what was there, what he had built for her in the darkness they shared, she broke. Because every shelf held lace, dozens of pieces, hundreds, years of her work that she thought had been destroyed the night they cast her out. He had found them, every last one, and he had kept them the way a man keeps holy relics, with reverence, with devotion, with hands that trembled in the dark. Can I tell you something? There is a reason stories like this have been told for centuries. It is not just the gowns or the grand estates or the titles. It is the feeling, that desperate, aching hope that someone, somewhere, will see who you truly are and choose you anyway. Welcome to Aristocratic Hearts. Tonight I have that kind of story for you. Before we begin, let me know where you are joining from. City, country, time of day. I want to picture you there, listening alongside me. Tonight's story takes us to the rolling chalk downs of Dorset in the year 1838, where a young lacemaker named Tansy Morell had her life ripped apart by a single lie. She was branded a thief. She was paraded through the village square with a wooden placard hung around her neck. She was exiled from the only home she had ever known, cast out onto the roads of England with nothing but the clothes on her back and a reputation so thoroughly destroyed that no parish, no workhouse, no employer would touch her. And then she stumbled, starving, half dead, delirious with fever, onto the grounds of a vast and silent estate in Hampshire. An estate whose master had not been seen in public for 4 years. An estate the locals spoke of in whispers. An estate belonging to a man the whole county believed had gone mad. They were wrong about him, just as they had been wrong about her. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment everything shattered. The year was 1838, and Tansy Morell was 21 years old, and she had exactly 14 hours left before her world ended. The village of Ashbury sat in a shallow valley in the Dorset countryside, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds by a ring of low hills and ancient hedgerows that had been there since before the Normans came. It was not a wealthy village. It was not a poor one either. It existed in that comfortable middle ground of English rural life, a place where everyone knew everyone, where the rhythms of the year were dictated by harvests and holy days, and where reputation was the currency that mattered most. Tansy Morell had lived in Ashbury her entire life. Her mother had died when she was 9. A fever that swept through the village in the wet autumn of 1826, taking 4 women and 2 children before it burned itself out. Her father, a wheelwright named Abel Morell, had raised her alone. After that, with the quiet, steady devotion of a man who understood that his daughter was the only beautiful thing left in his life. Abel taught Tansy to work with her hands. He taught her patience and precision and the particular kind of concentration that comes from understanding that a single misplaced element could ruin the whole. And Tansy, who had her mother's quick fingers and her father's stubborn perfectionism, took those lessons and applied them to lace. Now, it is important to understand what lace-making meant in rural England in the 1830s. This was not a hobby. This was not a gentlewoman's accomplishment performed between tea and embroidery. Lace-making in Dorset was an industry, a serious, demanding, economically vital craft that had sustained entire communities for generations. A skilled lace-maker could earn enough to support herself independently. A remarkable achievement for a woman in an era when the law treated female independence as somewhere between an inconvenience and an impossibility. The finest Dorset lace found its way to London to the modistes and drapers of Bond Street, where it adorned the gowns and veils and christening robes of the aristocracy. A single collar of exceptional work could fetch 3 or 4 guineas, more than most village labourers earned in a month. Tansy Morell's lace was exceptional. By 20, her patterns were being requested by name. She was not wealthy. No village lacemaker was wealthy, but she was independent. She earned her own money. She kept her own accounts. She maintained the cottage she shared with her father in good repair, and she owed nothing to anyone. This independence in 1838 was both her greatest achievement and her greatest vulnerability, because independence in a woman attracted attention. And not all attention was kind. Mrs. Prudence Garside had been Tansy's friend for 6 years, or rather, Tansy had believed her to be a friend for 6 years, which is not quite the same thing. Prudence was the wife of Sir Neville Garside, the local magistrate, a man of moderate wealth, considerable self-importance, and the particular brand of petty authority that comes from being the biggest fish in a very small pond. Prudence herself was a handsome woman of 34, well dressed by village standards, respected by the community, and possessed of a smile that could warm a room or freeze one, depending on its direction. She had taken an interest in Tansy 3 years earlier, when a London buyer visited Ashbury, specifically to examine Tansy's work. The buyer, a Mr. Crane, who supplied lace to several Mayfair establishments, had spent 2 hours at Tansy's cottage, examining her patterns, testing her thread, and placing an order worth 4 months of labour. Prudence had watched the transaction with the bright, interested smile of a supportive friend, and something behind that smile had curdled, because Prudence Garside had a secret she guarded more carefully than any lace pattern. She had been skimming household funds from Sir Neville's accounts for years, small amounts carefully disguised, redirected into a private reserve her husband knew nothing about. The money was not for extravagance, it was for survival. Prudence had married Neville Garside at 19 because she had no other options, and she had spent 15 years watching him drink too much, spend too freely, and make enemies of men who could destroy him. She was building a reserve against the day his recklessness caught up with them both. But reserves require replenishment. And when Prudence saw the kind of money that exceptional lace could command, when she calculated what Tansy Morell's annual output was worth, something shifted in her mind. She did not hate Tansy. That is important to understand. Prudence Garside was not driven by malice. She was driven by calculation. Tansy was an asset, a skilled producer of valuable goods, and Prudence intended to redirect that asset's output toward herself. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Prudence positioned herself as Tansy's business mentor and protector. She introduced Tansy to new buyers she controlled. She offered to manage Tansy's correspondence with London clients, claiming superior knowledge of business etiquette. She inserted herself gradually and pleasantly into every commercial transaction Tansy conducted, until she was handling a significant portion of Tansy's income flow, and then she began to skim. Not all of it. Prudence was too clever for that. She took a percentage, enough to matter, not enough to notice. She altered invoices. She quoted lower prices to Tansy while charging buyers the full amount and pocketing the difference. She collected payments on Tansy's behalf and reported figures that were consistently, subtly, lower than the actual amounts received. It worked beautifully for 3 years, and it would have continued working indefinitely had Tansy not received a letter directly from Mr. Crane. A letter that bypassed Prudence entirely. Crane was writing to commission a bridal veil for the daughter of a viscount. The commission was worth 15 guineas. And in his letter, Crane referenced the price he had paid for Tansy's last order, a price nearly double what Prudence had reported to Tansy. Tansy read the letter twice. Then she sat very still in her cottage, with the fire burning low and the November rain tapping against the window panes, and she understood. She did not confront Prudence. That was her mistake. Though in fairness, she did not yet understand the full scope of what she was dealing with. She simply decided to manage her own affairs going forward, cutting Prudence out quietly and without drama. But Prudence noticed. And Prudence, who had survived 15 years of a difficult marriage through calculation rather than confrontation, did not panic. She planned. On the morning of December the 14th, 1838, Tansy Morell woke to the sound of fists hammering on her cottage door. She opened it to find Sir Neville Garside flanked by 2 constables. Behind them, half the village had gathered in the grey dawn light, their faces a mixture of shock and something uglier, the hungry satisfaction of people about to witness someone else's destruction. Sir Neville held a lace christening shawl. Exquisite work, worth perhaps 8 guineas. Tansy recognised it instantly. It belonged to Mrs. Whitley, the vicar's wife, who had commissioned it 3 months earlier and paid Prudence directly. "This was found in your cottage," Sir Neville said. His voice carried the flat authority of a man accustomed to being believed. "Hidden beneath your mattress. Mrs. Whitley reported it stolen yesterday evening." "That is not possible," Tansy said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "I delivered that shawl to Mrs. Garside 2 weeks ago. She was to convey it to Mrs. Whitley on my behalf." Mrs. Garside states that no such delivery was made. And there it was. The trap, sprung with the clean precision of a mechanism designed by someone who understood exactly how power worked in a village where the magistrate's wife was also the accused's only witness. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted 20 minutes. Sir Neville presided. Prudence testified with tears in her eyes that she had never received the shawl, that she was devastated to learn her young friend was capable of such dishonesty, that she blamed herself for trusting too freely. Mrs. Whitley confirmed the shawl's value and her devastation at its loss. 3 neighbours testified that Tansy had been seen entering Mrs. Whitley's garden on the evening in question. Testimony that may or may not have been true, but that carried weight in a courtroom where the judge was married to the chief witness. Tansy was not permitted to speak in her own defence. This was not unusual. In 1838, the accused in a summary trial before a local magistrate had no automatic right to legal counsel, no right to cross-examine witnesses, and no practical ability to challenge the word of a magistrate's wife. The system was not designed for justice. It was designed for order, and order in a village like Ashbury meant that people like Sir Neville Garside decided what was true, and everyone else accepted it. Tansy was convicted of theft. She was sentenced to public shaming and banishment from the parish, a punishment that was in many ways worse than prison. Prison had an end date. Banishment was permanent. It followed you. It marked you. Every parish you entered would demand to know where you came from and why you left, and the answer, convicted thief, banished by the magistrate, would close every door before you could knock. They made her stand in the village square at noon. They hung a wooden placard around her neck. The word on it was thief, painted in letters large enough to read from across the green. She stood there for 3 hours while the village watched. Some looked away, most did not. Children pointed. Women she had known since childhood turned their faces. Men she had sold lace to for years stood with their arms folded and their expressions carefully blank, as though witnessing the public destruction of a neighbour's life was simply another event in the calendar, somewhere between the harvest festival and the Christmas pageant. Her father was not there. Abel Morell had died the previous spring. A slow decline that had left Tansy alone in the cottage, alone in the village, alone in the world. If he had been alive, things might have been different. Abel was respected. Abel had friends. Abel could have demanded a proper hearing, could have challenged Neville's authority, could have done something. But Abel was dead. And Tansey was alone. And alone in 1838 meant powerless. I have to pause here and tell you something. When I first put this scene together, I had to step away from my desk. The cruelty of it, not the dramatic, theatrical cruelty of a villain's monologue, but the quiet, bureaucratic cruelty of a system that allowed one woman's lie to erase another woman's entire existence. That is the kind of injustice that stays with you. Because it was real. This happened. Not to Tansey specifically, but to women across England, every day, in courtrooms where the verdict was decided before the accused walked in. The summary jurisdiction of local magistrates in the early 19th century was one of the most unchecked powers in the English legal system. A man could convict his neighbour, sentence his rival, and banish anyone who threatened his interests, all without appeal, without review, and without consequence. It would not be until later reforms that the worst abuses of this system were curtailed, and even then, the damage already done could not be undone. They gave her until sunset to leave. Tansey walked out of Ashbury with nothing. Her cottage had been seized. Neville claimed it as compensation for Mrs. Whitley's distress. Her lace, her bobbins, her patterns, her thread, all confiscated as evidence of the crime they said she had committed. The only things she carried were the clothes she wore and a small leather pouch containing 11 shillings and fourpence. Every penny she had managed to hide from Prudence's accounting over 3 years. She walked south. She did not know why south. She had no destination. She had no plan. She simply walked because standing still meant dying, and Tansey Morell, whatever else had been taken from her, was not yet ready to die. December in Dorset is not kind to people on the roads. The rain that year was relentless, cold, driving, horizontal rain that soaked through wool and leather and skin and settled into the bones like a permanent resident. Tansey walked for 3 days, sleeping in hedgerows and beneath bridges, eating nothing because the villages she passed through would not serve her. Word travelled fast in rural England. By the time she reached the Hampshire border, her reputation had preceded her. Convicted thief, banished woman. Do not employ, do not shelter, do not trust. On the 3rd night, she nearly died. The river was not wide, perhaps 15 feet across in dry weather, fordable at the shallow point where the road crossed it. But this was not dry weather. 3 weeks of December rain had swollen it to twice its width, the water brown and fast and carrying branches and debris from upstream. The ford was submerged. The nearest bridge was 4 miles north, and Tansey, shivering, starving, already feeling the first dull throb of the headache that would become a fever by morning, could not walk 4 miles. She could barely walk 4 steps. She waded in. The water hit her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. It was so cold that her lungs seized, and her vision went white, and for a moment she could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the current pulling at her skirts like hands trying to drag her under. She kept moving. 1 step, another. The riverbed was slick with mud and loose stones, and she felt her feet sliding, felt the current strengthening as she reached the centre of the channel, felt the water climbing to her chest and the cold closing around her ribs like a fist. She went under. It was not dramatic. She did not scream. She simply lost her footing on a stone, and the current took her. Sideways, downstream, her head submerging in water so dark and cold that the shock of it stopped her heart for 1 terrible suspended second. She clawed at the surface. Her fingers found nothing. The water filled her mouth, her nose, her lungs. The world became roaring and darkness and the absolute, animal certainty that she was going to die in a river in Hampshire and no one would ever know. Her hand caught a root, a tree root, jutting from the eroded bank, thick and gnarled and slippery with mud. She gripped it with both hands and held on. held on with the desperate, mindless strength of a woman who had already lost everything and was not prepared to lose the one thing she had left, which was herself. The current pulled. She held. The current pulled harder. She held harder, and slowly, with an effort that tore the muscles in her arms and scraped the skin from her palms, she dragged herself out of the water and onto the bank, where she lay face down in the mud, coughing river water, shaking so violently that the ground seemed to move beneath her. She lay there for a long time, long enough for the shaking to subside from violent to merely constant, long enough for the cold to settle from her skin into her bones, and from her bones into something deeper, a cold that was not merely physical, but existential, the cold of a woman who had just understood, with complete clarity, that the world would let her die, that no one was coming, that the river did not care, and the road did not care, and the villages did not care, and the only thing standing between Tansy Morell and the bottom of a Hampshire river was her own 2 hands and her own stubborn, furious refusal to stop breathing. She got up. She walked. On the 4th day, the fever found her. It started as a headache, dull, persistent, easy to ignore. By evening, it was a fire behind her eyes. By the following dawn, she could barely stand. She staggered along a lane she did not recognize, through a gate she did not remember opening, across a parkland so vast and overgrown that the grass reached her waist and the great oaks lining the drive had not been pruned in years. She collapsed at the foot of a stone wall. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was a house, enormous, silent, every window shuttered, every door closed, as though the building itself had turned its face away from the world. She did not see the figure watching from the upper window. She did not hear the door open. She did not feel the hands that lifted her, careful hands, uncertain hands, hands that moved with the cautious precision of a man navigating a world he could no longer see. Ormond Hale, the Duke of Bramfield, had not touched another human being in 4 years. He carried her inside anyway. Now I need to tell you who this man was, because you need to understand what it meant when a man like Ormond Hale decided to act. The Duke of Bramfield was 35 years old, possessed of £60,000 a year, and the master of one of the finest estates in Hampshire. He was also, by the standards of the world he had once inhabited, ruined. 4 years earlier, a riding accident on a rain-slicked road outside Winchester had thrown him headfirst into a stone wall. He survived. His sight did not. The blindness was total, not the gradual dimming that sometimes accompanied injury, not the partial vision that might have been managed with spectacles and strong candlelight. Total, permanent, absolute darkness. The physicians who examined him in the weeks that followed were unanimous in their verdict and merciless in their delivery. He would never see again. The world's response was swift and predictable. His fiancée, Lady Caroline Barwell, the daughter of an earl, a woman of exceptional beauty and precisely calculated ambition, broke their engagement within the month. She did so by letter. She did not visit. She did not offer an explanation that required his presence or his response. She simply wrote 4 lines of carefully worded regret and moved on to a viscount with functioning eyes and an estate in Kent. Society followed Lady Caroline's lead, as society always does. Invitations ceased. Visitors stopped calling. His name, which had once appeared on every guest list in London, disappeared from them as thoroughly as if he had died. In the eyes of the ton, he had. A blind duke was a contradiction in terms, a man of power rendered powerless, a man of presence rendered invisible. They did not know what to do with him, so they did nothing. They simply forgot. And Ormond, who had spent 31 years as one of the most visible men in England, retreated into silence. He dismissed most of his staff. He shuttered the London townhouse. He closed the wings of Bramfield Hall one by one, like a man sealing rooms in his own heart, until he lived in 3 rooms on the ground floor and spoke to no one except his valet, Mr. Josiah Fenn, who had been with him since boyhood and who refused, with the quiet, immovable stubbornness of genuine loyalty, to leave. That is the world Tansy Morell stumbled into. A vast, silent, shuttered house. A man living in self-imposed exile, a darkness so complete that when she opened her eyes 3 days later, burning with fever and disoriented beyond recognition, the first thing she heard was a voice she did not know, saying words that made no sense. "You are safe. You are in Bramfield Hall. My name is Fenn. You have been very ill." She tried to sit up. A hand pressed her gently back down. An old hand, weathered, careful. "Where?" Her voice was a rasp. "Where is the master of the house?" A pause. Then, from somewhere deeper in the room, a second voice, lower, rougher, with an edge to it that was not anger but something closer to rust, the sound of a voice that had gone unused for too long. "Here." She turned toward the sound. She could not see him clearly. The fever had blurred her vision, and the room was dim, lit only by a single candle on the far table. But she could make out a shape in the chair by the door, tall, very still, turned toward her with the particular attentiveness of a man who listened the way other people looked. "You collapsed on my grounds," he said. "Fenn brought you inside. You have been unconscious for 3 days. "I should not be." "Here," Tansy whispered. "I should go." "You should not go anywhere. You have a fever that nearly killed you. You weigh approximately 7 stone, and you are wearing a dress that is more holes than fabric. Where exactly do you propose to go?" She had no answer. She had no answer because there was no answer. There was nowhere to go. There was no one waiting. There was nothing. "Nowhere," she said, and the word came out not as defeat, but as fact, clean, honest, stripped of self-pity, a simple accounting of her situation. Something shifted in his expression. She could not see it clearly, but she felt it. A change in the quality of his attention, as though her answer had surprised him, and surprising a man who lived in permanent darkness was not easily done. "Then you will stay until you are well," he said. "Fenn will see to your needs." He rose. He moved toward the door with the careful, measured steps of a man who had memorized his own house by counting paces and trailing fingers along familiar walls. At the threshold he paused. "What is your name?" "Tansy. Tansy Morell." "And what brought you to my wall, Tansy Morell?" She was quiet for a long time. The candle flickered. The rain continued its assault on the windows. "A lie," she said. He did not ask what lie. He did not ask who told it. He simply nodded, a single, deliberate movement, and left the room. And that is how it began. The recovery was slow. The fever retreated in stages over the course of a week, leaving Tansy weak, hollow-cheeked, and possessed of a cough that rattled in her chest like stones in a jar. Fenn tended to her with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to managing crises. He brought broth, changed linens, administered the herbal draughts that the local apothecary prepared and left at the gate, and maintained a running monologue of gentle, meaningless conversation designed to fill the silence, without requiring response. The Duke did not visit during the first week. Tansy heard him sometimes. Footsteps in the corridor outside her room, pausing, then moving on. The sound of a pianoforte late at night, played with a technical precision that suggested years of practice and an emotional restraint that suggested something else entirely. Once, very late, the sound of something breaking, glass, or perhaps porcelain, followed by a silence so complete it felt deliberate. "Does he always keep to himself?" Tansy asked Fenn one morning, when the fever had receded enough for curiosity to replace survival. Fen was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care of a man who had spent 4 years being the only bridge between a duke and the outside world. "His Grace is not what the county believes him to be," Fen said carefully. "He is not mad. He is not dangerous. He is a man who lost everything he trusted, his sight, his future, the woman he was to marry, in the space of a single season. And he has chosen to endure that loss in private rather than perform it for an audience. The woman left him because he went blind. She left him because a blind duke could not give her what she wanted, which was not love. It was visibility, position, the reflected glory of standing beside a powerful man. When the power was diminished, when the man himself was diminished in the eyes of society, she had no further use for him. Tansy said nothing. She understood that kind of calculation. She had seen it in Prudence Garside's smile, the bright, warm, generous smile of a woman who measured every relationship by what it could provide her. "He does not deserve what happened to him," Fen added quietly. "And he would be very angry if he knew I had told you any of this." On the 8th day, Tansy got out of bed. She moved slowly, gripping the wall for support, making her way down the corridor with the shuffling determination of a woman who had decided that lying still was no longer an option. The house was enormous. She could feel its vastness in the echo of her footsteps, in the drafts that moved through empty rooms, in the dust that layered every surface like grey velvet. Most of the doors were closed. Most of the rooms were dark. The house felt like a held breath, waiting for something, or someone to give it permission to exhale. She found him in the library. He was sitting in a leather chair by the fire, his head tilted slightly to one side in the posture she was beginning to recognize as his listening position. A book lay open on the table beside him. An old habit, Fen had told her. He still kept books near him. He could no longer read them, but their presence comforted him. He knew she was there before she spoke. She had barely crossed the threshold when his head turned toward her, tracking the sound of her bare feet on the wooden floor with an accuracy that was almost unsettling. "You should be in bed," he said. "I have been in bed for 8 days. I am tired of bed." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile. She was not sure he remembered how to smile, but something adjacent to it, a loosening of the tension around his mouth. "Sit then, before you fall." She sat in the chair opposite his. The fire was warm. The library smelled of old leather and wood polish and something faintly green. Dried herbs, perhaps, or the ghost of a garden that had once been tended through the windows. "Fen tells me you are a lacemaker," the Duke said. "I was." "You are still alive. The skill has not left your hands. Therefore you are a lacemaker. The past tense is premature." She looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time, without the blur of fever. He was not what she had expected. She had imagined someone diminished, shrunken, reduced by his condition. But Ormond Hale was none of those things. He was tall, even sitting down, with broad shoulders and dark hair that fell forward across his forehead in a way that suggested he no longer cared how it looked. His eyes were open, pale grey, clear and utterly still. They did not track movement. They did not focus. But they were not empty. They held something she could not name. A quality of attention that had nothing to do with sight and everything to do with the intensity of a mind that had been forced to rebuild every tool it used to understand the world. "You said a lie brought you here," he said. "I have been thinking about that." "You do not need to concern yourself with my troubles, Your Grace. I have had nothing to concern myself with for 4 years. Your troubles are the most interesting thing to happen in this house since I broke a vase last Tuesday. Tell me." So she told him, She told him about the lace, about Prudence, about the skimming and the letter from Crane and the morning the constables came. She told him about the trial that was not a trial, about the placard around her neck, about the 3 hours in the village square while the people she had known her entire life watched and did nothing. She told him about her father's death and her mother's death, and the cottage that was taken, and the roads that led nowhere, and the doors that closed before she could knock. She told him all of it in the flat, controlled voice of a woman who had already grieved and was now simply reporting facts. And he listened, perfectly still, perfectly silent, with that unnerving attentiveness that made her feel for the first time in months that her words were landing somewhere real. When she finished, the fire had burned low. The room was darker. His face was half in shadow. "Garside," he said. "Sir Neville Garside, the magistrate." Yes. His wife orchestrated the theft accusation. Yes. And he presided over the trial. Yes. The Duke was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The rust was gone. What replaced it was something colder, harder, more precise, the voice of a man who had once commanded rooms and was remembering how. "That," he said, "is going to be a problem for them." Tansy stared at him. "Your Grace." "Do not argue with me. I have been sitting in this house for 4 years with nothing to do. You have just given me something to do. I intend to enjoy it." She wanted to protest. She wanted to tell him that it was not his fight, that she was a stranger, that he owed her nothing. But something in his expression, that cold, precise, newly awakened energy, stopped her. She had seen that look before, in the faces of men who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. Except those men had always been looking at something. The Duke of Bramfield was looking at nothing and seeing everything, but she had no idea what was waiting in that east wing. None at all. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Tansy had experienced. She healed. The cough receded. Colour returned to her face. Fen brought her proper clothes. Not a servant's dress, but a gentlewoman's wardrobe that had been stored in one of the closed wings, belonging to the Duke's late mother. The gowns were 20 years out of fashion, but beautifully made, and Tansy, who had spent her life in homespun wool and cotton, felt the silk against her skin like a whisper from another world. The Duke began to emerge from his self-imposed exile, not dramatically, not all at once, but in increments so small that only someone watching closely would have noticed them. He started taking meals in the dining room instead of his study, sitting at the head of a table built for 20, eating in silence while Tansy sat at the opposite end and pretended not to notice the way his head turned toward the sound of her cutlery against the china, tracking her presence the way a compass tracks north. He reopened the music room. She heard him playing one afternoon, not the precise, emotionless scales she had heard through the walls during her first week, but something different, something slower, more searching, as though his fingers were looking for a melody they had forgotten and were only now beginning to remember. He walked the grounds with Fen at his side, relearning paths that his feet remembered, even if his eyes did not. And one morning, a bright, cold morning in January when the frost made the parkland glitter like crushed diamonds, Tansy saw him from her bedroom window standing alone at the edge of the lake. No cane, no Fen. Just a man standing in the cold with his face turned toward the sky and his arms at his sides, and an expression she could not read from that distance, but that she felt, somehow, in the center of her chest. He stood there for 20 minutes. Then he turned, found the path with his feet, and walked back to the house. He did not know she had been watching. She never told him. But something in the way she spoke to him that evening, something warmer, something that had cracked open without her permission, told him that something had changed. He did not ask what. He simply listened more carefully, the way he always did when the world offered him something he could not see but could feel. And he talked to Tansy, not immediately, and not easily. The first conversations were awkward, stilted exchanges between two people who had each spent so long in isolation that the mechanics of ordinary conversation had become unfamiliar. He would ask a question, and then fall silent, as though he had used up his allocation of words and needed to rest before producing more. She would answer, and then stop, unsure whether she was speaking too much or too little, whether her voice was welcome or merely tolerated. But gradually, over days, then weeks, the awkwardness dissolved. It did not disappear. It transformed. It became something else, a particular kind of intimacy that exists only between people who have nothing left to perform. Neither of them had anyone to impress. Neither of them had a reputation to maintain. They were, in the truest sense of the word, free. Free to be exactly who they were, without the masks that society demanded and that both of them had worn for so long they had almost forgotten the faces beneath. Every evening after supper, they sat in the library. He asked her questions about lace-making, about Dorset, about her father and her childhood, and the way light fell through a bobbin lace collar when you held it up to a window. He listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who was building something in his mind. A picture, perhaps, of the woman sitting across from him, constructed not from sight but from sound and scent and the cadence of her voice. She described things to him. She had not planned to. It simply happened. She described the colour of the sunset through the library windows, the way the frost patterned the glass in the morning, the shape of the clouds, the specific green of new grass in the parkland. She did it without being asked, and she did it naturally. Not as a kindness or a charity, but as a sharing of something she had that he did not, the way you might share bread with someone who was hungry. He never thanked her for it, but she noticed that he leaned forward when she spoke, that his hands, which were usually still, sometimes moved, fingers curling slightly, as though trying to hold the images she was painting in his mind with nothing but words. On a cold January evening, 3 weeks after her arrival, she was describing a lace pattern she had designed the previous year, a complex border of hawthorn blossoms and briars that she had spent 4 months perfecting. The thorns curve inward, she was saying, tracing the pattern in the air with her fingers even though he could not see the gesture. Like a question mark almost, but tighter, and the blossoms sit just above them, so the effect is... She stopped. She had been so absorbed in the description that she had not noticed him stand. He was closer now, 2 steps closer than he had been, standing with his hand resting on the back of her chair. "Show me," he said. "Your Grace, I cannot. I have no lace. Everything was taken." "Show me on my hand." She stared at him. His hand was extended, palm up, fingers slightly spread, waiting. Slowly, carefully, she took his hand. His skin was warm. His fingers were long, calloused in unexpected places, the calluses of a man who had spent 4 years learning to navigate the world by touch. She turned his hand over and, with her fingertip, began to trace the pattern on the back of his hand, the curve of the thorn, the arch of the blossom, the intricate geometry of the border that had taken her 4 months to perfect, and that she could now recreate from memory with the precision of a cartographer drawing a map. She had walked 1,000 times. He did not move. He did not breathe. He stood absolutely still while her finger moved across his skin, and something in the room shifted. a thickening of the air, a gravity that pulled at them both, a silence that was no longer comfortable but charged with something neither of them was willing to name. When she finished, she released his hand. He did not pull it back immediately. It hung in the space between them for a moment, 2 heartbeats, 3, before he withdrew it slowly and returned to his chair. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. "You have remarkable hands," he said finally. His voice was rougher than before. "As do you, Your Grace." Another silence. Then, very quietly, almost inaudibly, he laughed. It was a short, startled sound, as though the laugh had escaped without permission, as though he had forgotten that laughing was something his body could do. "Can I just say, this is why I love writing these stories. That moment. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration. A laugh. A single, surprised, rusty laugh from a man who had spent 4 years in darkness and silence, startled back into sound by a woman who traced lace patterns on his palm. The Duke began his investigation into the Garsides with the methodical precision of a man who had once managed vast estates and parliamentary alliances. Blindness had not diminished his mind. If anything, it had sharpened it. Without the distraction of sight, he processed information with a ruthless clarity that Tansy found simultaneously impressive and slightly terrifying. He dictated letters, dozens of them, to Fenn, who wrote with the neat, efficient hand of a man accustomed to this particular role. Letters to solicitors in London, letters to land agents in Dorset, letters to Mr. Crane, the lace buyer, requesting a detailed accounting of every transaction involving Tansy Morell's work for the past 3 years, letters to the parish records office in Ashbury, letters to the county, assizes requesting transcripts of Sir Neville's judicial decisions over the past decade. "What are you looking for?" Tansy asked him one evening, watching Fenn seal the 14th letter of the day. "Patterns," the Duke said. "A man like Garside does not begin with you. You are not his first. Men who abuse judicial authority do so because they have done it before and gotten away with it. There will be others. Other convictions, other banishments, other lives destroyed for his wife's convenience. And those others will have left traces." He was right. The responses, when they began arriving in February, told a story that was both predictable and devastating. In the past 8 years, Sir Neville Garside had convicted 14 people of petty theft, vagrancy, or public nuisance, an unusually high number for a parish of Ashbury's size. 9 of those convictions had resulted in banishment, and in 7 of those cases the convicted person's property or business had subsequently been acquired by parties connected to the Garside household. It was not a pattern. It was a system. "He has been using his position to steal," Tansy said, reading the documents aloud to the Duke in the library. Her voice shook, not with fear, with rage, a cold, focused rage that she had not known she possessed until this moment, sitting in a fire-lit library with a blind Duke who had given her the one thing no one else in England would offer: belief. "His wife has been using his position to steal," the Duke corrected gently. "Garside is the instrument. She is the architect. A stupid man with authority married to a clever woman without scruples. It is one of the most dangerous combinations in English society. What will you do?" "Everything." He said it the way other men said good morning, flat, factual, inevitable. In March, something happened that changed the texture of everything between them. Tansy had been making lace again. Fenn had procured bobbins and thread from a supplier in Winchester, the finest available, purchased on the Duke's account, without discussion or permission. Tansy had protested. The Duke had ignored her protest with the serene indifference of a man accustomed to spending money on things he considered worthwhile. She worked in the morning room, where the light was best. The click of the bobbins became the heartbeat of the house, a rhythmic, delicate percussion that filled the empty hallways and drifted through open doors like music. It was the first sound, other than the pianoforte and Fenn's steady footsteps, that Bramfield Hall had heard in 4 years, and it changed the quality of the silence from something dead to something alive, from absence to anticipation. The Duke began finding reasons to pass through the morning room. He was not subtle about it. A man who counted his steps and memorized his routes does not accidentally end up in the same room 3 times before noon. Tansy said nothing about it. She simply continued working, and he simply continued listening, and the space between them continued to shrink in ways that had nothing to do with physical distance, and everything to do with the particular gravity that builds between 2 people who have each been alone for too long. One morning in late March, she was working on a particularly complex piece, a collar that required her complete concentration, when she became aware that he was standing in the doorway, not passing through, standing, listening. "You can come in," she said without looking up. "I did not wish to disturb you." "You are disturbing me by standing there pretending not to stand there." He came in. He sat in the chair nearest her work table, a chair that had not been there yesterday, which meant he had asked Fenn to place it there overnight, which meant he had planned this, which meant she was not the only one who had been thinking about proximity. He was very close, close enough that she, close, could smell the soap he used, clean and plain, nothing like the expensive colognes she imagined a duke would wear. Close enough that when he shifted in the chair, his knee nearly touched hers. "Describe what you are making," he said. She described it. The pattern, the technique, the way the threads crossed and recrossed to create the illusion of petals falling. He listened with that intensity she had come to depend on, the feeling of being heard so completely that every word mattered, every syllable carried weight, every pause was noted and held. "I wish I could see it," he said. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged his blindness as a loss rather than a fact. The words came out raw, unplanned, and he stiffened immediately afterward, as though he had revealed something he meant to keep hidden behind the high walls he had spent 4 years building. "You can," Tansy said. She set down her bobbins. She took the unfinished collar from the pillow and placed it in his hands. "Feel the edge. There, where the thread is densest. That is the center of the flower." His fingers moved over the lace with the same careful precision she had observed in everything he did. The way he navigated doorways, the way he found his chair, the way he held a teacup with exactly the right pressure to keep it steady without gripping too hard. He traced the pattern slowly, his face changing as he decoded the shapes, recognition replacing blankness, something that looked almost like wonder replacing the careful neutrality he wore like armor. "It is extraordinary," he said. His voice was hoarse. "It is unfinished." "It is extraordinary," he repeated. And then very quietly, "You are extraordinary." She did not answer. She could not answer, because his fingers had stopped moving over the lace and were now resting lightly, as though he was not sure he had the right, on her wrist. Her pulse beat against his fingertips like a trapped bird, and the room was very still and very warm, and his face was turned toward hers with an expression she could read, despite the fact that his eyes could not see hers, an expression of longing so naked, so unguarded, that it took her breath away. "Your Grace." "Ormond." "I cannot call you that." "You can. I am asking you to." "Ormond." It came out like a breath, like something she had been holding in her chest for weeks and was only now allowing to escape. His hand tightened on her wrist, not painfully, possessively. The grip of a man claiming something he had been afraid to reach for, something he had convinced himself he did not deserve, something he wanted so badly that the wanting itself had become a kind of pain. Then he released her. He stood. He left the room without another word. And for the rest of the day, Tansy heard nothing but the echo of her own name in his voice and the phantom pressure of his fingers on her pulse. Now, I know some of you are screaming at your screens right now. Trust me, keep listening. Because what happened next nearly destroyed everything they had built. And it came from the last direction either of them expected. The jealousy came in April, and it came wearing a pleasant smile. Mr. Aldous Crane, the London lace buyer, arrived at Bramfield Hall in person, responding to the Duke's letters with a visit rather than a reply. He was a man of 40, well-dressed, articulate, and possessed of the particular charm that came from years of doing business with wealthy women. He had come to discuss the legal case against the Garsides, bringing documents and testimony that would be crucial to the prosecution. But his eyes, from the moment he entered the morning room and saw Tansy at her work, were not on the documents. "Miss Morell," he said, taking her hand and holding it a fraction longer than courtesy required. "I was devastated to hear what happened. Your work, your extraordinary work, deserves better than what those people did to you." Tansy smiled. It was a polite smile, nothing more. The automatic courtesy of a woman who had been raised to be gracious even when she felt nothing. But the Duke, who was standing by the window with his face turned toward the sound of the exchange with the fixed attention of a hawk tracking movement on a distant field, went very still. Crane stayed for 3 days. He was charming, helpful, and transparently interested in Tansy in a way that went beyond professional admiration. He complimented her work. He complimented her resilience. He found reasons to be near her, to speak with her, to brush her hand when passing documents across the table. On the second evening, Tansy was reading aloud to the Duke in the library, a habit they had fallen into, one of the quiet intimacies that had come to define their days, when Crane appeared in the doorway. "Am I interrupting?" he asked. "Yes," the Duke said. The word landed like a stone in a still pond. Crane blinked. Tansy froze. The Duke did not move from his chair, did not alter his posture, did not raise his voice. He simply said the word with a flat, absolute finality that left no room for interpretation or social manoeuvring or the polite fiction that all three of them were simply friends enjoying an evening. Forgive me. I merely wish to discuss the timeline for the Assizes hearing with Miss Morell." "Miss Morell is occupied. You may discuss the timeline with me. Tomorrow." Another silence. Tansy watched Crane's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and the particular kind of social retreat that comes from recognizing that you have stepped into territory belonging to a man far more powerful than yourself, even a blind one. Especially a blind one. Because a duke who cannot see you is a duke who does not care what you look like, and a duke who does not care what you look like is a duke who will not be charmed, will not be disarmed, and will not be moved by anything other than the cold mathematics of power. "Of course. Tomorrow, then. Good evening." Crane withdrew. The Duke said nothing for several minutes after Crane left. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked through the silence like a metronome measuring tension, then very quietly, with a control that was more frightening than any outburst could have been. "He looks at you. He cannot help how he looks at me, Your Grace. Ormond. Ormond. He looks at you the way a collector looks at a painting he intends to acquire. I may be blind, Tansy, but I am not deaf. I hear the way his voice changes when he speaks to you. I hear the way his breathing shifts when you enter a room. I hear the chair scrape when he moves closer to you at the work table. and I am not a fool. No one has ever accused you of being a fool. Then understand me clearly." He turned toward her, his grey eyes unseeing but blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch, found her face with uncanny precision, guided not by sight but by the sound of her breathing, the warmth of her body, the particular quality of the air between them that he had learned to read the way other men read expressions. "I have lived in darkness for 4 years. You are the only light I have known in all that time, and I will not share you, not with Crane, not with anyone, not ever." The words hung in the air between them, raw, possessive, devastating in their honesty. He had not planned them. She could hear that in the ragged edge of his voice, in the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair as though the chair was the only thing keeping him anchored to his seat, in the slight tremor of a man who had just exposed something he had been guarding with every ounce of his considerable discipline. "Ormond," she said, just his name. But she said it the way he said hers, like a vow, like a prayer, like something sacred and fragile and entirely new. He exhaled, a long, shaking breath. His grip on the chair arms loosened. "I should not have said that," he said. "Yes," Tansy said, "you should have." Crane left the following morning. Nobody mentioned why. In the days that followed, something shifted between Tansy and the Duke. Not a distance exactly, but a new awareness. The declaration had changed the air between them. Before, their evenings in the library had carried the comfortable warmth of companionship, two people who enjoyed each other's company and did not examine too closely why. Now every silence was heavier, every accidental touch, her hand brushing his when she passed him a teacup, his fingers finding her elbow to guide her through a doorway before he remembered that she was the one who could see, carried an electric charge that made them both draw back as though burned. She began to wonder what would happen when the case was won, when the Garsides were convicted and her name was cleared, and there was no longer any practical reason for her to remain at Bramfield Hall. She would have her reputation restored. She could return to Ashbury, reclaim her cottage, rebuild her business. She could leave. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. One evening in late April, she was reading to him from a volume of Wordsworth, his favourite, she had learned, though he would never have admitted to something as vulnerable as having a favourite poet, when he interrupted her mid-stanza. "When this is over," he said, his voice was carefully neutral, too carefully neutral. "When Garside is convicted, what will you do?" She closed the book. The leather cover was warm from her hands. "I have not decided. You could return to Dorset. Your name will be cleared. The cottage may be recoverable. You could resume your work there. I could. You would have your independence back, your life such as it was. You would be free." "Yes?" A silence. The fire shifted, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. His jaw was tight. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were very still. The deliberate stillness of a man who was controlling himself with everything he had. "Is that what you want?" he asked. And Tansy, who had learned in that courtroom, and in those frozen December roads, and in every moment of her 21 years that honesty was the only currency worth carrying, to expout, said, "No." He did not move. He did not speak. But she heard his breath catch, a single sharp inhalation, and she saw his fingers tighten on the chair arm and then release, slowly, one by one, like a man letting go of something he had been gripping too hard for too long. Neither of them said anything else. She opened the book and continued reading. But the stone in her chest was gone. And when she glanced at him, quickly, the way you glance at the sun, because looking too long at something that bright will change you, she saw that the corner of his mouth had lifted. Not a smile, not yet, but the promise of one, the architecture of one, the foundation upon which in time a smile might be built. And then he sent her away, Not cruelly, not coldly, with the careful, measured logic of a man who had spent his entire adult life making decisions based on what was correct rather than what was wanted. The trial was 3 weeks away. The Duke's barrister had written to say that Tansy's presence in Dorchester before the hearing would be necessary, to review documents, to prepare her potential testimony, to be seen by the judge and the officers of the court as a credible witness rather than a last-minute addition. It was the sensible thing. It was the proper thing. And Ormond Hale, even in the grip of a feeling that had overturned every other certainty in his life, remained a man who did the proper thing. "Fen will accompany you," he said, standing in the hallway with his hands clasped behind his back and his face arranged in the expression she had come to recognize as his mask, the neutral, controlled, aristocratic blankness he wore when he was feeling something too large to show. "You will stay at the Crown Inn. The rooms have been arranged. The barrister will meet you there on Tuesday." "And you?" "I will follow in a fortnight. There are matters here that require my attention." There were no matters. She knew it, and he knew it, and Fen, standing 3 paces behind the Duke with his travel bag already packed and his face carefully expressionless, knew it. The Duke was sending her away because he did not trust himself to be near her for 3 more weeks without saying something or doing something or becoming something that he had not yet given himself permission to become. He was protecting her, or protecting himself, or both. And the distinction at that particular moment did not matter, because the result was the same. She left on a grey May morning. The carriage was waiting in the drive. Fen held the door. The Duke stood on the front steps, tall, dark, his cane in his right hand and his left hand hanging at his side with the particular stillness of a man who was preventing himself from reaching for something. "Ormond," she said from the carriage window. He turned toward her voice. His blind eyes found her face with that uncanny precision that still, after 5 months, made her breath catch. "Be safe," he said, and then so quietly that Fen pretended not to hear. "Come back." "I will." The carriage pulled away. She watched him through the rear window until the drive curved and the trees closed around him and he was gone. A dark figure on the steps of a silent house, standing perfectly still, listening to the sound of her leaving. The week in Dorchester was the longest of her life, not because of the legal preparations, which were tedious but straightforward, not because the Crown Inn was uncomfortable. It was perfectly adequate, clean and warm and staffed by people who treated her with the deference owed to a guest of the Duke of Bramfield. The week was long because he was not there, because every evening when the work was done and the barrister had gone and Fen had retired to his own room, Tansy sat alone in a chair by the fire and felt the absence of a voice she had come to need the way she needed air. She had not known it was possible to miss someone this completely, to feel another person's absence as a physical weight, a hollow in the chest, a silence that no amount of noise could fill. She wrote to him. 3 letters in 7 days. She did not send them. She kept them in the drawer of the writing desk and understood with a sudden piercing clarity that almost made her laugh exactly how he had felt writing those 23 letters in the dark. On the 8th day, Fen knocked on her door. "The Duke has arrived, miss. He is downstairs, and he has asked, rather urgently, if I may say, to see you." She went downstairs. He was standing in the inn's parlour, travel-dusty, his cane in one hand and his other hand gripping the back of a chair as though the chair was the only thing keeping him upright. He had come a day early. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week. "You came early," she said. I could not. He stopped. He cleared his throat. He tried again. The house was intolerable. I could not hear your bobbins. I could not hear your footsteps. I could not hear... He broke off and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I lasted 8 days. I had planned to last 14. I am apparently not as disciplined as I believed. Apparently not. Are you angry? I am the opposite of angry. He exhaled. His grip on the chair loosened. And for the first time since December, since the wall, since nowhere, something in his face settled into an expression that was not controlled or careful or masked. It was simply happy. Quietly, cautiously, tentatively happy. The happiness of a man who had forgotten the shape of the feeling and was relearning it, one feature at a time. What happened next would change everything. Everything. In May, the Duke's solicitors completed their case against the Garsides. The evidence was devastating. 3 years of altered invoices, falsified records, forged receipts, and testimony from 7 other victims of Sir Neville's judicial corruption. The Duke had assembled it all from a dark library in Hampshire, dictating letters and analysing responses with the precision of a man building a cathedral, one stone at a time, by touch, alone. But Tansy did not know about the other thing. The thing Fenn had been doing on the Duke's private instructions since January. Quietly, carefully, with the systematic thoroughness that characterised everything Ormond Hale undertook. It was Fenn who told her, the evening of the Duke's arrival in Dorchester, while Ormond was meeting with the barrister downstairs. There is a room, Fenn said carefully, standing in the corridor outside her bedroom, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression arranged in the particular combination of formality and tenderness that he reserved for moments of significance. At Bramfield, 2nd floor, East Wing. His Grace asked that I tell you about it before the trial. He intended to show you himself, but... Fenn paused. He could not wait. What room? I think, Fenn said, it would be better if I described it to you. And then, when we return to Bramfield after the trial, you can see it for yourself. So, Fenn told her. Standing in the corridor of the Crown Inn in Dorchester, with the sounds of the town drifting through the window and the evening light fading, Josiah Fenn described the room in the East Wing. The shelves, the lace, the bobbins, the green velvet pillow. He described how the Duke had given instructions by touch, measuring each shelf with his palms, running his fingers along the wood to check that every piece was level. He described how every piece of lace Tansy had ever made, the collar for Mrs. Whitley's sister, the cuffs for the Salisbury draper, the veil fragments she thought had been burned, the practice work from when she was 15, had been bought back, tracked down, recovered from drapers and clients and parish stores across 3 counties. He sent me with letters and money, Fenn said. I travelled the roads you walked in December, miss, except I walked them in the opposite direction, not fleeing but gathering. And then Fenn reached into his coat and withdrew a leather case. Inside were papers, letters, in Fenn's handwriting, because the Duke could not write. But the words were his, dictated in the dark, spoken aloud in a room where no one but Fenn could hear, and then set aside, unsent, because the man who had spoken them did not yet believe he had the right. He asked me to bring these to you. Tonight, Fenn said, before the trial. He said you should know, before you stand in that courtroom, what you are to him. There were 23 letters, dated from January to May, written to her, but never given to her. The first was brief, almost businesslike, as though he were writing to convince himself rather than her. I do not know why I am writing this. You are sleeping in the room below mine, and I cannot stop listening for the sound of your breathing. This is not how a gentleman behaves. I am aware of that. I am writing it down so that I can see, hear, How absurd it sounds. It does not sound absurd, it sounds true. The seventh was longer, more dangerous. You described the sunset tonight as copper and rose. I have not seen a sunset in 4 years, but when you spoke, I saw it, not with my eyes, with something else, something I do not have a name for, something that lives in the space between your voice and my heart. The 15th was raw, almost incoherent. Crane touched your hand today. I heard it. The brush of skin on skin across a wooden table. I wanted to break every bone in his fingers. I am a duke. I am a civilized man. I wanted to break his hand. What is happening to me? The last, the 23rd, was the longest. I have been in darkness for 4 years, and you are the only thing I have ever wanted to see. I would trade every day of sight I ever had for one more evening in that library, with your voice painting the world I cannot reach. I am lost. I have been lost since you traced hawthorn blossoms on my hand, and I felt your pulse beneath my fingers and understood that I would never be the same. You came to my wall half dead, and you brought me back to life, and I do not know how to tell you this because I have never told anyone anything that mattered. I have given orders, I have made demands, I have controlled and commanded and managed, but I have never said the simple, devastating, terrifying thing that I am saying now, which is that I love you. I love you. I love you in the dark. I love you without seeing your face. I love you with every sense I have left, and it is not enough, and it will never be enough, and I do not care because even this imperfect, blind, stumbling love is more than I ever thought I would feel again. Tansy read them all. She read them, sitting in the chair by the fire at the Crown Inn, then on the floor with her back against the bed frame, and tears streaming down her face and her hands shaking so badly that the pages blurred and the words swam, and she had to stop and press the heels of her palms against her eyes and breathe. Just breathe, before she could continue. Fenn stood in the doorway. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. When she had finished, she folded the last letter carefully, pressed it to her chest, and said, in a voice that was steady despite everything, "Where is he?" "The parlour downstairs, miss, with the barrister, but I believe the barrister has just left." She went downstairs. She crossed the hallway of the Crown Inn. She opened the parlour door. He was standing by the fire. He had heard her coming. Of course he had. He always heard her coming. He had been listening for the sound of her footsteps since the day she collapsed against his wall. And he was standing with his back to the door and his hands braced on the mantelpiece, and every line of his body rigid with the particular tension of a man who has just exposed his entire soul and is waiting to learn whether it will be accepted or destroyed. "You kept my lace," she said. He did not turn around. "Yes." "You wrote me letters." "Yes." 23 letters. Fenn counted. "You built me a room." "I built you a home. There is a difference, Ormond. I understand if you wish to leave. The case against Garside does not require your presence at Bramfield. I can arrange rooms in Dorchester. You would be comfortable. You would be free to—" "Ormond." He stopped. His hands tightened on the mantelpiece. She could see the tendons standing out on the backs of his hands, the white of his knuckles, the tremor in his wrists. She crossed the room. She stood beside him. She reached up and turned his face toward hers, gently with both hands, the way she handled her most delicate lace. And she said the only thing that mattered. "I am not leaving." His breath caught. A sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. Something between the two. Something that had no name because it belonged to a feeling that had no precedent in his experience. "I cannot see your face," he whispered. "I want to see your face." "Then see it." She took his hands from the mantelpiece and placed them on her cheeks. "Here. See it." His fingers moved over her face the way they had moved over the lace. Slowly, carefully, reading her features like a language he was learning for the first time. Her cheekbones, her brow, the line of her jaw, the curve of her mouth. He traced everything, and as he traced, his expression changed, the rigid control dissolving, the walls coming down, the man behind the Duke emerging for the first time in 4 years, blinking in the light of something he had been afraid to feel. "You are beautiful," he said. "I have always known you were beautiful. But I did not know—" His voice broke. His thumbs rested on her cheekbones, and his unseeing eyes were bright with tears he had not shed since the accident that took everything except the one thing that mattered most. Did not know what? How much it would feel like this. She kissed him. She did not wait for permission. She did not wait for him to decide. She simply rose onto her toes and pressed her mouth to his, and for a single, perfect, devastating moment, the darkness did not matter. Nothing mattered. Not the case, not the Garsides, not the 4 years of silence or the roads she had walked or the doors that had closed. Just this. Just him. Just the feeling of his hands in her hair and his mouth on hers and his heart beating against her chest like a man coming back to life. When they finally separated, he did not step back. He kept his hands where they were, one in her hair, one at the small of her back, and his forehead rested against hers, and for a long time neither of them moved. The fire crackled, the clock ticked. Somewhere in the inn, Fenn was not present, with the tactful precision of a man who knew exactly when to be nowhere. "I have one condition," Tansy said. He went very still. "Name it." "Tomorrow, when you stand in that courtroom and you tell them what was done to me, I want to be there. Not in the corridor, not in a waiting room, in the gallery, watching. I want them to see my face when the verdict comes. I want Prudence Garside to look at me and know that I survived, that I am standing, that I am not broken." His arms tightened around her. His voice, when it came, was rough and low and carried a weight of feeling that she would remember for the rest of her life. "You will sit in the front row of that gallery," he said, "and I will stand in front of that courtroom. And when it is over, when every lie has been stripped away and every truth has been spoken, we will walk out of that building together, and no one will ever look through you again." She pressed her face into his shoulder. He smelled of soap and road dust and the particular warmth of a man who had travelled a day early because he could not bear another night without the sound of her breathing. She breathed him in. She held on. And in the parlour of a country inn, with the sounds of Dorchester settling into evening beyond the window, two people who had lost everything found the one thing that could not be taken: the choice to stay. The trial of Sir Neville and Mrs. Prudence Garside took place at the Dorchester County Assizes on the 12th of June, 1839. I want to pause here and tell you something about what this moment meant, not just for Tansy, but for the reality of women and criminal justice in this era. In 1839 England, a woman accused of a crime faced a system that was built, from its foundations to its rafters, by men, for men, in the interests of men. She could not serve on the jury that judged her. She could not practice the law that prosecuted her. In many courts, she could not even speak in her own defence without permission from the presiding magistrate, who was, of course, also a man. The odds were stacked so heavily against a woman accused of theft that many did not bother to fight the charge at all. They accepted their sentence. Transportation, imprisonment, banishment, because fighting required resources they did not have. Money for a solicitor, standing in the community, and the one thing that no system of justice should require, but that every system of justice in 1839 demanded: a powerful man willing to speak on your behalf. When Tansy Morell walked into that courtroom in Dorchester, she walked in with something that most women in her position never had. She walked in with a duke. And that, more than any evidence or testimony, is what made this trial different from the thousands of quiet, invisible injustices that happened in magistrates' courts across England every year, and were never challenged, never appealed, and never remembered. Now, a county assizes in 1839 was a very different thing from a local magistrate's summary hearing. The assizes were presided over by circuit judges, senior legal officials appointed by the Crown, who travelled the country twice a year hearing serious criminal cases. They were public, they were formal, they were recorded, and they operated well above the reach of a village magistrate's petty authority. A man who could control a summary hearing in his own parlour could not control a courtroom presided over by a King's Bench judge with a lifetime appointment and no interest whatsoever in the social dynamics of a Dorset village. I have to tell you, the scene I am about to describe is one of my favourites in this entire story, because this is the moment where everything turns. Where the man who lived in darkness stands up in front of the world and uses his voice, the only weapon he has left, to set the truth on fire. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread across 3 counties. The Duke of Bramfield, the blind recluse who had not been seen in public for 4 years, was bringing a prosecution against a sitting magistrate. The gallery was full of lawyers, journalists from the county papers, and members of the local gentry who had come as much for the spectacle as for the justice. Several of them had done business with the Garsides. Several of them were already calculating the implications for their own affairs. Tansy sat in the witness gallery. She was dressed in silk. The Duke's mother's gown, altered by her own hands to fit perfectly, every seam straight, every hem precise, because she was a woman who understood that detail mattered and that the world judged women by their appearance long before it judged them by their words. Her hair was pinned. Her back was straight. She looked nothing like the starving woman who had collapsed at Bramfield's wall 6 months earlier. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had survived destruction and emerged from it with a duke at her side and the truth as her weapon. The Duke entered last. He walked without assistance, a decision he had made that morning over Fenn's strenuous objections. He moved slowly, his cane tapping the flagstones with a rhythm that echoed through the silent courtroom like the beat of a war drum. Every eye was on him. He could not see them watching. He did not need to. He knew what he looked like, tall, dark, impeccably dressed, his blind eyes open and his expression set, in the cold, aristocratic mask that generations of breeding had given him. He looked exactly like what he was, a duke. Not a ruined one, not a diminished one. A duke in the full and terrifying authority of his power, come to deliver judgment on those who had harmed what was his. He took his place in the front row, and when the judge called for the prosecution's opening statement, the Duke of Bramfield's barrister rose. But it was the Duke himself who stood immediately after, requesting permission to address the court directly. The judge, after a moment of consideration, granted it. One did not lightly refuse a duke. He spoke for 40 minutes. He did not read from notes. He could not read from notes. And this, paradoxically, made his address more devastating, not less. He laid out the case with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 5 months assembling evidence in total darkness, who had listened to every document read aloud 3 times, who had committed every figure, every name, every date to memory, because memory was the only tool he had left. He named names. He cited figures. He produced, through his barrister, letters, affidavits, and the sworn testimony of 7 witnesses who had suffered the same fate as Tansy and been too powerless to fight back. farmers and tradespeople and widows who had been convicted on fabricated evidence, banished from their homes and stripped of their property, all to feed Prudence Garside's secret reserve. The courtroom was silent throughout. Not the restless silence of boredom, but the held-breath silence of a room full of people watching something they would remember for the rest of their lives. "This woman," the Duke said, and he did not point. He could not point. But every person in the room understood that he meant Tansy, sitting in the gallery with her hands folded and her spine like iron, was convicted of a crime she did not commit, sentenced by a court that was not impartial, and banished from her home by a man whose wife had stolen from her for 3 years. She lost her cottage. She lost her livelihood. She lost her reputation. She nearly lost her life. And she would have died on the roads of Hampshire, alone and forgotten, had she not collapsed, by the grace of God and nothing else, at the wall of my estate. He paused. The silence was absolute. "I cannot see your faces," he said. His voice dropped, but it carried every word distinct, every syllable weighted with the authority of a man who had learned to make his voice do the work his eyes no longer could. "But I can hear your breathing. And I know that every person in this room understands what I am about to say. The law exists to protect the powerless from the powerful. When a magistrate uses that law as a weapon, when he turns the machinery of justice into a tool for personal enrichment, he does not merely break the law. He breaks the covenant between power and duty that holds this entire system together. And when that covenant is broken, it falls to those of us who still honor it to repair the damage. That is why I am here. That is why she is here. And that is why these two people—" He turned his head unerringly toward the dock where the Garsides sat. "Will answer for what they have done." He sat down. The courtroom erupted, but the Duke's speech was not the only testimony that day. The judge, after restoring order, called Tansy Morell to the witness stand. She had not expected this. The Duke's barrister had told her it might happen, that the judge might wish to hear from the victim directly. But she had not prepared, had not rehearsed, had not planned what she would say. She simply rose from her seat in the gallery, descended the narrow stairs, crossed the courtroom floor with every eye upon her, and took her place in the witness box. The dock was 10 feet away. Prudence Garside was sitting in it. Tansy looked at her. She looked at her steadily, without anger, without performance, without the trembling vulnerability that the gallery might have expected from a woman confronting the person who had destroyed her life. She simply looked, the way you look at something you have finally understood after years of confusion. And Prudence, who had maintained her composure throughout the Duke's speech, who had sat with her hands folded and her spine straight and her expression arranged in the careful mask of injured dignity that she had worn so successfully for so long, Prudence looked back, and the mask broke. It did not shatter dramatically. There was no scream, no collapse, no theatrical display of the kind that Prudence herself might have manufactured for effect. It was quieter than that, and worse. The mask simply slipped. The corners of her mouth, which had been held in a careful line of dignified composure, began to tremble. Her eyes, which had been fixed on a point somewhere above the gallery, the posture of a woman refusing to acknowledge the proceedings, dropped to Tansy's face and could not look away. And in those eyes, Tansy saw it. Not remorse, not guilt, not the dawning horror of a woman who understood what she had done. Something colder, something more honest, fear. The pure, animal fear of a woman who had spent her entire life calculating outcomes and had finally encountered one she could not control. "Miss Morell," the judge said. "In your own words, tell the court what happened." And Tansy spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She told the truth, plainly, precisely, in the flat, steady tone of a woman who had learned that facts do not need decoration to be devastating. She described the friendship, the skimming, the letter from Crane, the morning the constables came, the trial that lasted 20 minutes, the placard, the square, the 3 hours. She did not look away from Prudence while she spoke, not once. And Prudence, who had smiled through 6 years of theft, who had wept convincing tears on a witness stand while swearing she had never received that shawl, who had walked through the village of Ashbury with the serene confidence of a woman who believed she would never be caught, sat in that dock and watched the last 6 years of her life disassembled, piece by piece, by the woman she had tried to erase. Her hands, folded in her lap, began to shake. Her chin, held high with such practiced dignity, dropped by degrees until she was staring at her own trembling fingers. The mask did not return. It could not. There was nothing left to hold it up. Sir Neville fared worse. He had none of his wife's composure to begin with, and without it he was simply a small, sweating, terrified man in a courtroom full of people who now knew exactly what he was. He wept. He stammered. He attempted once to claim that he had been manipulated by his wife, a defense that the judge dismissed with a single, withering sentence that the courtroom would repeat for years afterward. The verdict took less than an hour of deliberation. Sir Neville Garside was found guilty of judicial corruption, abuse of office, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He was sentenced to transportation to the penal colonies, 14 years. Prudence Garside was found guilty of theft, fraud, and perjury, 7 years. Their property was seized by the Crown. Their assets were frozen. Their name, which had commanded the village of Ashbury for a decade, was finished, erased as thoroughly and as permanently as they had once erased Tansy Morell's. And this is where something remarkable happened. Something I want you to remember, because it speaks to the kind of man Ormond Hale truly was. When the sentences were read, Tansy expected the Duke to be satisfied. She expected the cold precision to remain, the controlled triumph of a man who had executed a plan to perfection. But when she looked at him, sitting in the front row of that courtroom, with his cane across his knees and his blind eyes open, she saw something she had never seen on his face before. Not triumph, not satisfaction, relief. The bone-deep, exhausted relief of a man who had been carrying a weight he had not chosen and had finally set it down. He had done this for her, not for justice in the abstract, not for the principle of the thing, for her, because she had been wronged, and he had the power to make it right. And in his world, in the world of dukes and obligations and the fierce, possessive, absolute loyalty that had defined his ancestors for generations, that was simply what you did. Tansy descended from the witness box. She did not cry. She did not cheer. She walked across the courtroom floor with the same steadiness with which she had crossed it to testify, and she felt something she had not felt since the morning the constables came to her door, a feeling she had thought was dead, buried under the rubble of everything that had been taken from her. Vindication. Not the wild, soaring triumph she might have expected. Something quieter. Something that settled into her bones like warmth after a long cold. The simple, profound, world-altering relief of being believed. After the verdict, the Duke found her in the corridor outside the courtroom. He moved toward her with that measured stride, his cane tapping, his face turned in her direction with the particular intensity she had come to read as his version of looking. More focused than sight, more honest than eyes. "It is done," he said. "Yes." "How do you feel?" She considered the question. She considered it honestly. the way he had taught her to consider everything, without performance, without pretense, without the polite fiction that feelings could be summarized in a single word. "Whole," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you remember what I asked you the first night? Where you proposed to go?" "I said nowhere." "And now?" She looked at him, at his unseeing eyes and his tired face, and the hand he held out to her with the same careful precision with which he did everything. The hand that had carried her inside when she collapsed at his wall. The hand that had gripped a chair arm while confessing he would not share her. The hand that had trembled against her cheek when he traced her face for the first time. "Home," she said. "I propose to go home." He extended his hand. She took it, and they walked out of the Dorchester courthouse together. The blind duke and the lacemaker, the man who could not see and the woman who had been invisible, into the June sunlight that she could see and he could feel, warm on their faces and their joined hands, and the crowd parted for them like water, and nobody, not one single person in that packed corridor, looked away. There is more to tell. There always is, with stories like this. But let me give you the ending. This story deserves, the ending Tansy Morell deserves, after everything. They returned to Bramfield Hall on a warm June evening, 3 days after the verdict. The drive was long and the carriage was quiet, and Tansy spent most of the journey watching the Hampshire countryside past the window while Ormond sat across from her with his hand resting on her knee and his blind eyes closed and an expression on his face that she could only describe as peace. Fenn met them at the door. He said nothing. He simply looked at Tansy, then looked at the staircase, and Tansy understood. She went upstairs alone. The east wing corridor smelled of beeswax and dust and something else. Lace. The particular faint clean scent of thread and starch that she had known since childhood, that she associated with her mother's workroom and her father's cottage and every good thing she had ever made with her hands. She opened the door, and there it was. Everything Fenn had described, the shelves, floor to ceiling, oak, sanded smooth, the lace on every shelf arranged with a care that made her throat close, the bobbins on the work table, the Flemish thread, the green velvet pillow, her 15-year-old practice work on the highest shelf, clumsy and imperfect and precious beyond measure. She walked the room slowly, her fingers trailing along each shelf the way his fingers trailed along walls, reading by touch, understanding by feel. She picked up the collar she had made for Mrs. Whitley's sister and held it to the light from the window and saw her own stitches, her own patterns, her own hands in every thread. She had thought this was gone. She had thought all of it was gone, burned or confiscated or scattered to the four winds of a county that did not care. And he had found every piece. A blind man, working by instruction, building shelves he would never see to hold the work of a woman he loved. She did not hear him come in, but she felt him, the way she always felt him, the change in the air, the gravity of his presence. "You found them," she said. Her voice broke on the last word. "Everyone." "How?" "Fenn. Letters. Money. Patience. The same tools I used for Garside, except—" and here his voice softened into something that was almost tender. "These were more important." She turned. He was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, his head tilted toward her in that listening posture that she would never, as long as she lived, stop loving. "This is the room from the cold open," she did not say, because she did not know she was in a story. "But I know, and you know. And now you understand why she broke." She crossed the room. She took his hand and placed it on the nearest shelf, on the collar she had made when she was 15, the clumsy, imperfect, beautiful first thing her hands had ever created. "Feel it," she said. His fingers moved over the lace, and his face, that controlled, careful, aristocratic face, what you crumbled. Not into grief, into gratitude, into the overwhelming, wordless gratitude of a man who had been given something he did not know how to earn and could not bear to lose. They stood like that for a long time, in a room full of lace, in a house full of light, in a world that had tried to destroy them both and failed. They married in September at the chapel at Bramfield Hall. It was a small ceremony. Neither of them wanted spectacle, and the Duke, who had spent 4 years avoiding the eyes of the world, had no interest in inviting them back now. The chapel was ancient, Norman stone, with narrow windows that turned the afternoon light to gold and scattered it across the floor in long, warm rectangles. Beeswax candles lined the aisle, their flame steady and quiet in the still air. The scent of them, clean, sweet, faintly honeyed, filled the chapel like a benediction. Someone had placed late roses on the altar, white and pale pink, their petals beginning to soften at the edges, breathing out a perfume so faint that you had to be standing very close to catch it. Tansy noticed that the roses had been arranged at a height where a man could touch them. Not see them, but touch them. Fenn's doing, she was certain. Everything in this house that was kind and considered and silently thoughtful was Fenn's doing. Tansy wore a gown of white silk, trimmed with her own lace. A bridal veil she had spent 3 months making, the most intricate and beautiful piece she had ever produced. It was a masterwork of hawthorn blossoms and briars, the same pattern she had first traced on his hand in the library on that January evening when everything changed. The blossoms were dense and layered, each one containing 14 separate threads worked so fine that they were almost invisible to the eye. The briars curved inward between them, sharp and elegant, their thorns rendered in thread so precisely that they cast tiny shadows when the light caught them. The veil caught the candlelight from the chapel windows and turned it into something that looked like trapped starlight, as though she were wearing not lace, but light itself, woven into fabric by hands that understood both beauty and pain, and had learned to make one from the other. The Duke could not see it, but standing at the altar he reached out and ran his fingers along the edge of the veil, tracing the pattern with the same careful precision he had brought to everything. To the investigation, to the letters, to the room full of lace, to the way he had learned to love her without ever once needing to see her face. His fingers moved slowly. His expression, visible to Tansy and to Fenn and to Alma and to the elderly vicar who had married Bramfield dukes for 40 years and had never once wept at a wedding until this one. His expression was not joy exactly. It was recognition. The deep, bone-level recognition of a man who had been lost and had found his way home, not by seeing the path, but by feeling it beneath his feet. "The thorns curve inward," he said softly, like a question mark. "Yes." "And the blossoms sit just above them." "Yes." "I remember." Of course he remembered. He remembered everything. Every word she had spoken, every pattern she had traced on his skin, every sunset she had described, and every silence they had shared, and every laugh that had escaped them both in that dark, beautiful library where two broken people had found each other and discovered that the pieces fit. Now, it is important to understand what this marriage meant in the eyes of the law. Because the law in 1839, as we have discussed, was not kind to women, and marriage was the moment when its unkindness became most absolute. Under the doctrine of coverture, the moment Tansy spoke her wedding vows, she would legally cease to exist as an independent person. Her property, such as it was, would become her husband's property. Her earnings would become his earnings. Her very legal identity would be subsumed into his, as though she had been absorbed, erased, folded into the larger entity of the married couple in which the husband was everything and the wife was nothing. This was the bargain that every woman in England made when she married, and it was the reason many women of intelligence and means chose not to marry at all. Tansy Morell, who had fought for her independence since she was old enough to hold a bobbin, was choosing to surrender it. She was choosing to place her legal existence, her financial future, and her personal autonomy into the hands of a man she had known for less than a year. But here is the remarkable thing. The thing that set Ormond Hale apart from nearly every other man of his station and his era. Before the wedding, he had his solicitors draw up a separate deed of trust that placed the lace-making workshop, its income and its assets entirely in Tansy's name. It was, for 1839, an almost unheard-of act of legal generosity. A duke voluntarily surrendering control over his wife's earnings before the marriage had even begun. When Tansy read the deed, she looked at him and said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, "You are giving me back what the law would take away." And he said, "I am giving you what was always yours." Fenn stood as best man. He wept quietly into a handkerchief he had prepared for the occasion, because Josiah Fenn was a man who planned for everything, including his own tears. Miss Alma Catton, Tansy's childhood friend, the only person in Ashbury who had refused to believe the accusation, the woman who had been quietly sending word of Tansy's survival to anyone who would listen, and who had testified at the assizes with a ferocity that surprised everyone who thought they knew her, stood as witness. She held Tansy's bouquet during the vows and cried openly and without shame, and told Tansy afterward that if the Duke ever mistreated her, she would come to Hampshire personally and make him regret it, blind or not. Ashbury sent no one. Ashbury had not been invited. But Ashbury heard. Of course Ashbury heard. News of the Garside conviction had reached the village within days of the verdict. Carried by the county papers, by travellers on the roads, by the particular velocity with which scandal moves through small communities that thrive on it. The same people who had stood in the village square and watched Tansy Morell wear the word thief around her neck now read the Dorchester court reports and learned that every word of her accusation had been a lie, that the magistrate who convicted her was a criminal, that the friend who testified against her was a thief, the real thief, the only thief, the one who had been stealing for years while hiding behind a warm smile and a respected name. The reaction in Ashbury was not shame. That would have required a degree of self-reflection that most of them were not capable of. The reaction was silence. The thick, defensive silence of people who know they were complicit in something terrible and have decided, collectively and without discussion, to never speak of it again. Mrs. Whitley, the vicar's wife, retired from public life entirely. She was seen less and less at church, less and less at market day, and eventually not at all. She simply disappeared behind the walls of the vicarage and did not emerge, as though the weight of what she had participated in had finally settled on her shoulders and pinned her there. The three neighbours who had testified that they saw Tansy in Mrs. Whitley's garden that evening developed, in the months that followed, a curious inability to meet each other's eyes. They did not discuss what they had done. They did not apologize. They simply avoided one another and avoided anyone who might remind them, and carried the knowledge of their participation like a stone in the pocket, always present, never acknowledged, impossible to set down. The cottage, Tansy's cottage, the one Neville had seized, sat empty. No one would live in it. No one would buy it. It became, in the way of small villages, a monument to something the village preferred to forget. its windows darkening with dust, its garden going to seed, its front door swinging on broken hinges in the winter wind like a mouth trying to speak a name that no one wanted to hear. But there was one person in Ashbury who did not fall silent. Alma Catton, the blacksmith's daughter, Tansy's friend since childhood, had never believed the accusation, not for a moment. Not when the constables came, not when the placard was hung, not when the entire village looked at Tansy and saw a thief. Alma had looked and seen her friend, and she had said so, loudly, publicly, and at considerable cost to her own standing. She had been shunned for it. She had lost customers at her father's forge. She had been called naive, gullible, and worse. And she had not wavered. When Tansy's letter arrived, the first letter, written from Bramfield Hall in shaking handwriting on the Duke's own stationery, Alma had wept. Then she had dried her tears, put on her good dress, and walked to the centre of Ashbury and read the letter aloud to anyone who would listen. Most would not, but some did, and the ones who did carried the knowledge home with them and set it beside the other knowledge, the knowledge of what they had watched happen in the village square on the 14th of December. And the two pieces of knowledge sat together in uncomfortable proximity, like strangers forced to share a bench, and neither one would go away. 6 months after the wedding, Tansy reopened the east wing of Bramfield Hall, the wing the Duke had closed when he closed himself away from the world, and established a lace-making workshop. She hired 12 women at first, 6 from Dorset, 6 from Hampshire, and began teaching them the techniques and patterns that had made her work famous. Within a year, the workshop employed 20 women. Within 2, it employed 30. Bramfield lace was sold in London, in Paris, in Vienna. It was worn by countesses and marchionesses and, on one memorable occasion, by a princess of the blood who declared it the finest work she had ever touched. The workshop paid fairly, housed its workers decently, and gave every woman who passed through its doors the one thing Tansy Morell understood better than anyone alive: independence. Not the fragile, conditional independence of a woman tolerated by her community, but the solid, unshakable independence of a woman who earned her own money and answered to no one and could not be destroyed by a magistrate's wife with a grudge and a forged receipt. One morning, a bright Tuesday in April, 2 years after the wedding, a woman arrived at Bramfield Hall on foot. She was young, perhaps 19, hollow-cheeked, with the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from physical labour, but from the sustained effort of being afraid. She carried nothing but a bundle of cloth and a letter of introduction from a vicar in Wiltshire, who had heard through the particular network of whispered recommendations that connected women in trouble across the south of England, that the Duchess of Bramfield hired women who had nowhere else to go. Tansy met her in the morning room. She offered tea. She did not ask where the woman had come from or what had happened to her. She simply placed a bobbin in her hand, smooth, weighted, warm from Tansy's own palm, and said, "This is how you hold it. This is how you begin." The woman's name was Ruth. Within 6 months, her lace was being sold in Bath. Within a year, she had saved enough to rent a cottage of her own in the village. She left Bramfield Hall on a morning much like the one on which she had arrived, except that this time she was carrying not a bundle of cloth, but a set of bobbins, a bolt of Flemish thread, and a letter from the Duchess of Bramfield confirming her credentials and recommending her work to any buyer in England. Tansy watched her walk down the drive. She did not cry. She simply stood at the window and watched until Ruth disappeared around the bend in the road, and then she turned back to the morning room, where 18 other women sat at their pillows with bobbins clicking, and she resumed her work. And the Duke, who could not see the lace or the women or the light, pouring through the workshop windows that he had ordered unshuttered for the first time in 5 years. Listened to the click of bobbins echoing through the halls of his reopened house, and felt something he had not felt since the horse threw him into that wall on a rain-slicked road outside Winchester. Purpose. Life. Joy. The particular, specific, irreplaceable joy of watching, truly watching, even without eyes, the woman he loved build something magnificent from the wreckage of what had been taken from her. Because Ormond Hale, the Duke of Bramfield, had understood something that the rest of the world had missed. He had understood it from the moment he heard her voice in that sick room, steady and unbroken despite everything that had been done to her. He had understood it from the moment she traced lace patterns on his hand without being asked, sharing her world with him simply because it was there to share. And she was the kind of person who shared. He had understood it the way only a blind man can, not with his eyes, but with every other sense he possessed, with every fibre of his being, with the absolute certainty of a man who could not be deceived by appearances because he had no appearances to be deceived by. She was not a thief, she was a queen, and he claimed her. Not with titles or wealth or the crushing power of his station, though he had all of those things and would have used every last one of them to protect her. He claimed her with attention, with patience, with 23 letters he never sent, and a room full of lace he could not see, and a love so complete, so overwhelming, so fundamentally different from anything the world had told either of them to expect, that it did not require sight to recognize what it had found. And that, my friends, is the story of Tansy Morell and the blind Duke of Bramfield. I poured a lot of myself into this story, and I hope you felt that. If it resonated with you, let me know in the comments. And if you want to support this channel, subscribing is the best way to do it. Thank you for being here. Tell me, what was the moment that hit you hardest? Was it the lace room? The letters, the courtroom, the veil at the altar? I want to know. Drop your answer below, along with where in the world you're listening from right now. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about being seen, truly seen, by someone who loves you, share this with them. Until next time.